You think you know the UFC? Think again. You've probably seen every fight, followed every champion, and know all the knockout highlights. But I bet you didn't know these wild facts that even the fighters themselves might not be aware of. The UFC is full of surprises, and there's so much more going on behind the scenes than just punches and kicks. Get ready for a deep dive into some of the most mind-blowing facts that could make even the toughest fighter say, "Wait, what?" Let's start with something you probably didn't expect. Did you know the UFC's first ever event wasn't even called UFC? Yep, it was initially marketed as Ultimate Fighting Championship in 1993, but before that, the first event was called UFC 1, and the purpose was pretty wild: no rules. That's right, no weight classes, no time limits, and no real restrictions. It was pure chaos, and many fighters were competing without even understanding what they were getting into. Imagine stepping into a cage for the first time and not knowing if you're about to face a boxer, a wrestler, or a karate expert. The only thing that mattered was who could survive. Now, I gotta take a moment to say thank you for sticking with me this far. I know, this is a lot to digest. It's crazy how much history is packed into this sport, and I'm so glad you're still here to learn about it. Keep reading because we're just getting started. Here's another shocking fact. The UFC wasn't always the powerhouse it is today. In the early days, the organization was struggling to stay afloat. With its controversial nature and brutal matches, it was actually banned in multiple states. Can you imagine that? The UFC banned in places? They had to fight for legitimacy, both in the eyes of the public and the government. Fast forward to now, and the UFC is one of the most successful sports organizations in the world. But without those struggles and setbacks, who knows if we would have the UFC as we know it today? And let's talk about the fighters for a second. The UFC's roster is filled with some of the most talented athletes in the world, but did you know that some of the top UFC fighters actually had other careers before stepping into the cage? Take Randy Couture, for example. Before he was the UFC Hall of Famer we know and love, he was a wrestler, but not the type you might think. Couture was an Olympic-level wrestler who nearly made the US Olympic team. He then transitioned to MMA, where he went on to become one of the greatest of all time. You've probably seen some of the most iconic UFC fighters like Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey, but do you know how much they've actually made for their fights? Sure, they get the big paychecks, but there's something most people don't realize. The UFC doesn't just pay for fights. They also bring in major sponsors and pay-per-view bonuses. Conor McGregor, for example, earned millions from his fights, but he also raked in a huge amount from his deals with companies like Reebok and Proper No. 12 Whiskey. The UFC fighters are more than just athletes, they're entrepreneurs. Another mind-blowing fact, there are some UFC champions who actually never lost a fight during their careers. Khabib Nurmagomedov, for example, retired undefeated with a 29-0 record. That's insane. And let's not forget about fighters like Anderson Silva, who dominated for years with a reign of 10 consecutive title defenses. But here's the twist. While their success seems flawless, every one of these champions faced obstacles that almost nobody saw. The amount of preparation, sacrifices, and struggles behind the scenes are unimaginable. And here's one more for you. Did you know that some of the most successful UFC fighters were actually training in other sports first? Georges St-Pierre, one of the most well-known champions, began his career in karate before transitioning to MMA, and before becoming the Spider, Anderson Silva was a soccer player. It's fascinating how fighters from completely different sports backgrounds can make it to the UFC and dominate in a completely different arena. It's proof that talent is versatile, and when it's honed right, it can break boundaries. You see, the UFC is more than just a sport. It's a battle of grit, resilience, and adaptability. The facts that even the fighters may not know just prove that there's always something new to learn in this crazy world of combat sports. It's a constantly evolving game where new champions emerge, records are broken, and history is made every time the cage door locks. So next time you watch a UFC fight, just remember, there's a whole lot more happening behind the scenes than what you see on TV. And trust me, it's more fascinating than you can imagine.